Hey there everybody, it's Mark Crilley. I'm back with another video. Today we are going to be getting into making comics, and we're going to focus in particular on the early stages of how you go from a script to planning out what goes into each panel and what point of view you're going to use, all of that stuff. I honestly think that this is the most important aspect of comic creation. So I've written out a very short little piece of script here, and I'll just read it out. Arrival at the temple. Tex and Isaac reach the top of the stairway. Isaac: how do you know the treasure is unguarded? Tex: the locals don't dare come to this place. They think it's cursed. Howl of wind. Isaac, nervously: what makes you so sure it isn't? Now, this is not exactly inspired script writing here, but I wanted to keep it simple so that everyone knows basically what's going on in this scene. It's almost a little bit of a cliche the way it's set up, but I want to show you how would I go from this to creating comic book panels that tell this story. Well, I'm going to go ahead and move this stuff out of the way. I may sort of keep bringing the script back periodically to show my ideas for how to turn this into comic book storytelling. But let's begin, first of all, by creating on a scrap piece of paper, this is just like cheap printer paper, the dimensions of the rectangle that I have to fill here. Now, I've based this on the YouTube video horizontal format, and so that's why I'm going to be designing all of these panels to fit that screen. But, with comics, something for publication, I probably would do more of a vertical format. Now, give me a minute. I'm going to refocus so we can get into the details of this. All right, so this whole scene I have entitled The Arrival at the Temple. And so the first panel I'm going to put over here because I had this vision of the temple itself being at the top of a mountain, and that they've had to go up these steps, this long series of steps to get there. So you see me just sort of roughly putting in this vertical panel over here. And so the steps could be at the bottom. And one of the first decisions I have to make is, are we going to get to the dialogue right away? Well, there's not a lot of space for a whole lot of panels here, so I think, yes, for sure, let's get to that first line of dialogue. Isaac, the sort of junior partner character, says, how do you know the treasure is unguarded? So right at the beginning, I'm going to go ahead and put in a speech bubble in anticipation of that. And I might even start to write out the words to get a sense of what shape that speech bubble is going to have to be. How do you know the treasure is unguarded? Right now, I'm not doing a lot of work to make this legible because this is just my rough. I'm just trying to figure out how much space will these words take up. And the reason that I'm doing that is so that I know how much of this first panel is going to be devoted to writing. And I don't want to waste my time putting a bunch of work into artwork that's going to get obliterated or covered up by speech bubbles. So that's my thinking, and that's why I get these speech bubbles or some approximation of them into position right at the beginning. And so let's say Tex is a little further up the steps. He's the leader. He's the guy who's going to get there first. I'm going to give them both walking sticks, but you can see I'm not putting a whole lot of time into details. This is really just kind of figuring out where is everything going to be. So now that I've got that in place, and let's say that there is foliage here in the foreground as they reach the top of the mountain or whatever to where this temple is going to be. I'll go ahead and just darken this in real quickly. Now I know how much space is left for drawing the temple itself, and so I might go ahead and put in a couple of pillars here that are supporting the entrance, because that's going to be important. I think this sense of like, where are they going to be going? And let's create some sort of doorway, some sense of a doorway here. And then above this, maybe just start to throw in some suggestion of architectural detail that I'm going to get to later, and maybe not even in this video. You know, I'm probably going to keep things fairly loose, even when I get to my final artwork, just because this is more or less, you know, the focus of this is not so much on teaching you how to create final artwork as it is to map out panel by panel what is going on in each panel. I really think that this is the heart and soul of comic book storytelling, this preparatory process of making those decisions. So I got this panel out of the way. The next one, we got Tex saying to Isaac, the locals don't dare come to this place, they think it's cursed. So we got two sentences here, and my instinct generally is to break them into two separate speech bubbles. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. And so let's think about what will work as a panel. How about if we come up here and make a nice big horizontal panel. It's going to leave some space below for whatever we choose to do with that remaining space. But again, right from the beginning, I think I'm going to start thinking about the speech bubbles. Maybe the first line, the locals don't dare come to this place, would fit in here, more or less. And my feeling is I like when I can sort of separate the two and create a little bit of a pause. This one I'm going to just make a smaller one. They think it's cursed, because I know that I don't need a whole lot of space for that. But how about if we get a little closer to Tex's, the face of Tex, we get a look at him and start to figure out what kind of a character he is. And one of my one of my thoughts about differentiating these characters right from the get-go is to give them two different hats, so that even when we see them from a distance, we understand who is who. So I guess I'm setting Tex up as a slightly greedy character who has no respect for the locals and so forth, and he's you know, we can sort of see in the way I draw his face that maybe he's not such a good guy. And I'll go ahead and put a little shade over his eyes to sort of figure. I'm not getting too much into the details, but I'm already starting to think a little bit about, okay, when I get to my final artwork, what kind of things am I going to be doing? Now, why don't I just do quickly in time lapse what I did here, writing out the dialogue. All right, so this has already helped me to understand, you know, how much space is left over for Isaac if we're going to include him in this panel. How about if we've put the camera pretty close to Tex's face and Isaac is much further back here. Maybe he's sort of wiping his brow with a little cloth, since it does seem like it's a little bit like that in Indiana Jones, Raider of the Lost Ark scene at the beginning of that movie where they're in the tropics. And so I'm going to give him a little more of a floppy hat. How about if he has glasses? That'll be another thing that differentiates us, or differentiates the two characters one from the other. I suppose they're both going to be carrying backpacks. But again, not getting too much into the details, just sort of figuring out what am I going to be putting in here. Maybe there's enough space for a little indication of this foliage, you know, so that we sort of understand what point of view that these characters are not just floating in a white space, but we have some sense of, oh right, we are looking toward them now instead of toward the temple as we were in the previous panel. So that gives me the basics of what I'm going to do with that panel. And then the next dramatic thing is there's this howl of wind. And so my feeling is that one deserves a fairly big panel, and indeed the sound effect itself becomes important. So I'm going to go ahead and write in that foo sound that indicates the wind, and give that a substantial amount of the sort of real estate. And I'm thinking, why not just have it continue, bust out of this panel and continue on into the other panel? That can be a fun way of sort of linking things, and you sort of maybe hear the trailing off of the wind even when you move to that next panel. And for this one, as the wind blows, I'm thinking we should get a view of the dark entrance that we're going to be headed into. So it's this sort of like the Hollywood, a howl of wind does not necessarily mean that anything bad is going to happen, but it sort of creates that atmosphere. And so we want the drawing to cooperate with that. And if you've got this very darkly shaded entrance along with the sound effect, that can help to convey that sort of story beat of, ooh, sounds like everything's not quite as simple as it seemed, almost like the wind is warning them off, you know. And then over here, I guess we have enough space to get the two characters in the foreground. Again, because I've given them two different hats, maybe that is going to help us to differentiate, just in silhouette almost, who is who. And I always love to, whether it makes sense or not, to darken in and push these guys into the foreground by way of a bit of shading, almost turning them into silhouettes. There's not going to be a whole lot of space here. You can see for the details of the temple, but maybe there's just enough that we can begin to get some sense of other parts of it beyond the entrance. Now we're down to this final panel, and I think definitely the whole purpose of this panel is to show Isaac's nervousness and his response to what makes you so sure it isn't cursed. And in this case, because I've decided to make the foo, the wind sound, come across the top, rather than fighting with that, I'm going to put the speech bubble at the bottom. And again, I'll do this in time-lapse to figure out where the words go. So again, by getting these speech bubbles in place, you know, at the outset of this thumbnail process, I figure out how much space is left for drawing Isaac's face. And we've gone fairly close up on this guy's face. I figure rather than make it exactly the same type of a close-up, we almost should go even tighter in on old Isaac, so that we really can see his nervous-looking eyes, and we'll get the get the eyebrows curved up to the middle. But I'm starting to see, well, don't, this is showing me, well, don't make that sound effect take up too much space, because you're going to need that for the drawing of Isaac's face. And you can see that I'm running out of space almost for his mouth, so we'll see later on when I get to doing the final artwork. I may tweak this so that I change the size of this panel a bit to get more space for Isaac's face. Otherwise, I'm kind of just assuming the bottom part of his chin here is going to get covered up by speech, the way I've done this. We'll put some sweat drops coming down his face. And there you go. That's my kind of rough plan for how this is going to go. And believe it or not, I feel that that really is one of the most crucial parts of the comic book creation process, is plotting this stuff out, figuring out where does everything go in each panel. Now I'm going to go ahead and bring out my nicer piece of Bristol board here, and we're going to jump into the process of doing the final art. I got to warn you, though, it's going to be almost entirely in time-lapse, because, like I said, this video is mostly focused on this, the planning stage. But let's go ahead and get into it. All right, so we're almost ready to get into the final art, line art, but I wanted to point out that the speech bubbles are not actually going to go into this artwork. I'm leaving those out. I'm going to be doing all that in Photoshop. That's my preference. I think publishers enjoy having that flexibility of having the text, at the very least, on a separate level in Photoshop, so that it can be changed into another language, or that the editing process doesn't become too cumbersome. If you've written it by hand, changing every word, it becomes quite laborious, of painting out words and rewriting them and so forth. So you're going to see me do all the artwork without the speech bubbles, but with the knowledge of how much space is required for the speech bubbles, which really is quite crucial. So let's get into it. I'm going to do all the line art all in time-lapse, and then we'll come back and we'll sort of compare and see, did I change anything from the plan to the final. All right, well, we've finally reached the end of my final line work. As you can see, still quite sketchy. If I was really doing this for publication, I would probably put even more time into it. But you get the basic idea of how I took this first sketch and translated it into final artwork. Pretty close, I would say. I didn't change too much there. I guess I found with this one that once I've got these two speech bubbles in place, there was a lot of extra space on this side to add in more foliage and kind of fill that in. So that's one thing that's a little bit different. I might even find myself, after I've scanned this in, shifting this guy over just a little bit, because we do need more space for what he says in this speech bubble compared to what he says in this one. So let's see if that one works out. My little plan to do a little bit of digital trickery, but you can see that the foo sound of the wind blowing by pretty much went according to the first plan. I think I even took less space of this final panel with that trailing off of the O's there. Otherwise, yeah, pretty close. I think I was able to get a little more of the backpack and the upper shoulders area in here than I might have done in my first plan. And yeah, you can see me sort of, I put in time-lapse, you might have seen me put in this speech bubble down here so that I could kind of figure out where his mouth was going to be. I think, to be honest, even after putting in all this time, so much of this is just going to be completely covered up. But I just I realized that was going to happen, and maybe I just decided to finish off the artwork because I just don't. Part of me just doesn't like a big blank area that is completely reliant on the speech bubble to cover it up. So anyway, I'm going to scan this all into the computer. Going to add just a little bit of toning. Try not to get too carried away with that. I'll print it out, and then I'll be back with a few final words. All right, well, let's go back and review the different steps, starting with the script. Very important. Got to work out my dialogue before I can get into the thumbnails and start solving the problems of, how much space is devoted to the speech bubbles versus the artwork, what point of view, everything. I mean, this is actually, everything depends on this step in the process, figuring out what's going into each panel. Now, I did make one change, and I'm sorry that I didn't show this in the video, but as I got closer to completion, I thought I want to sell this idea of wind, because the sound of the foo sound, you don't necessarily know what that's coming from. So I added a bunch of leaves and a couple of lines here, and now we can do the big reveal of the final printed out version with the speech bubbles added in Photoshop, and just a little bit of toning here and there. I tried not to go too crazy with relying on the digital additions, but you can see that I sort of darkened some of these foreground elements and maybe lightened these leaves, played around with the shadow being cast on their faces. But there you go. That is my process, more or less. Like I said, for finished publication, I would probably go a little farther with this artwork in terms of refining things. Certainly if it was a full color book, well boy, I'd have put in another hour or so adding color to this. But this really shows you the different steps, and it all starts with just this little bit of writing. So I hope you found this video useful. Give me just a second. I'm going to go ahead and grab my books so that I can thank the people who have supported me by getting them, like My Last Summer with Cass, my latest graphic novel. If you get this one, you can see what my storytelling techniques are like in a real published form. Mastering Manga 1, 2, and 3, these books contain loads of information about page layouts and different stuff relating to creating comics. And of course, The Comic Book Lesson, coming out July 26th. This really is my book that focuses on the topic that you saw in today's video, really guiding you towards the basics, the fundamentals of learning to think the way a comic book creator does, so that you can take your story ideas and translate them, as we did today, into comic book storytelling. But I do think it is time for me to lay down this pencil. I want to thank you all for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. And I'll be back with another one real soon.